I had rehearsed the words in my mind all morning, whispering them to myself in the quiet corners of the kitchen as I made tea, repeating them while folding laundry, practicing the rhythm of the sentences, the way someone practices a confession they know might break their own heart. I told myself that this time I would not hesitate. This time I would speak clearly. This time I would not let my voice tremble or my thoughts scatter like fragile leaves caught in a breeze. It was important. It was something he needed to hear. And I believed, foolishly, hopefully, heartbreakingly, that my son would listen. That he would give me a moment of stillness, a moment of care, a moment of the boy he used to be before the world shaped him into someone who moved too fast to see me standing in the doorway. I told myself all morning that he would hear me, that he would put down his phone, slow his breathing, and look at me with the eyes that once searched my face for every answer. I told myself this because I needed to believe it. I needed to believe I still mattered. The house was quiet when I called him, the kind of quiet that revealed the faint humming of the refrigerator and the soft ticking of the wall clock, sounds I had grown used to living alone. I sat at the dining table with my fingers wrapped around my mug to steady myself as I waited for him to answer. When his voice finally filled the speaker, clipped and distracted, something in my chest tightened. He sounded rushed, as if my call had interrupted an important moment. He asked if everything was all right in a tone that carried more impatience than concern. I swallowed the sting of that and told him I needed to talk to him, just for a few minutes, just to explain something, just to share something personal. I heard him sigh, not heavily, not angrily, but in that subtle exhale of someone who feels inconvenienced. Then he said he only had a few minutes because he was heading out. Still, I told myself it was enough. I began to speak, slowly, carefully, choosing each word with the precision of someone carrying something fragile. But the moment the first sentence left my lips, I felt myself stumbling over the details, pausing too long between thoughts, searching for the right phrasing, because I wanted him to understand the weight of what I was trying to share. It took me longer to speak these days. My mind worked differently now. Thoughts came like tides instead of waves, rising slowly before reaching the shore. I knew this. I lived with this. But I hadn't realized how deeply it irritated him until that moment. Because halfway through my second sentence, before I could finish explaining, before I could lay the truth bare the way I had practiced all morning, he cut me off. He said the words lightly, casually, with a tired laugh that felt like a blade pressed against skin. "You talk too slow, Mom. Just text me instead." I froze. My heart lurched. The room tilted for a moment. He said it the way someone swats away a fly, harmless in tone, devastating in meaning. There was no malice in his voice. That almost made it worse. Because he didn't even realize he was hurting me. He didn't notice the way my breath caught, or the way my silence thickened, or the way my soul folded in on itself like a shrinking shadow. He didn't hear the importance of what I had been trying to say. He didn't sense the tremor in my voice. He didn't hear the plea beneath the words. He just wanted me to stop talking. I felt something fissure inside me, delicate and old, like the crack of a porcelain bowl that had held too much weight for too long. I paused, trying to gather myself, trying to hide the tremble in my voice, as I murmured that I could text him instead if that was easier. He didn't hear the pain behind my words. He only said good, because I've got to go now, and goodbye. Then the line went dead, leaving me with the faint buzzing of the call ending and the weight of everything I hadn't said pressing down on my chest. I stared at my phone for a long time after that, feeling the warmth of the mug fade in my hands, feeling the quiet swell around me until it felt like the walls were leaning closer. My son had always been quick, quick to talk, quick to act, quick to decide. I had loved that about him. But in that moment, I realized he had become quick to dismiss me too, and for the first time, I wondered when it had begun. At what point had my voice become an inconvenience? When had my pauses become too long for his pace? When had the woman who once narrated his childhood stories become the person he no longer had patience to hear? I stood up slowly and walked to the window, watching the street outside where life continued without hesitation. Cars moved. Children laughed, neighbors walked their dogs. The world was fast, faster than me, faster than my son, faster than the conversations we used to have at the kitchen table, where he once listened to every word I said as if it were the key to understanding the universe. I pressed a hand to the glass, feeling the cold against my skin, grounding myself in the present moment, trying not to let the ache swallow me whole. I told myself it wasn't personal. I told myself he was busy. I told myself he didn't mean it the way it sounded. I told myself anything I could to keep from collapsing into the truth, because the truth was brutal. The truth was simple. The truth was that my child had grown into a man who no longer knew how to hold space for me. A man who lived in a world that rewarded speed and efficiency and left no room for the slow, tender pacing of a mother's voice. I walked back to the table and looked at the phone again. Text him, he said to text him, and for reasons I didn't yet understand, that instruction rooted itself inside me like a seed. I sat down, opened the message screen, stared at the blinking cursor. The simple act of typing felt foreign, like replacing a heartbeat with a machine. But I lifted the phone anyway because mothers adapt. Mothers bend. Mothers reshape themselves to fit their children's needs, even when it tears something inside them. But this time, something else stirred too. Something I had buried so deeply beneath years of being patient and gentle and quiet. Something that whispered that maybe this was not just about convenience. Maybe this was an invitation to finally speak without being interrupted, without being judged, without being dismissed. Maybe texting would allow me to put into words what my voice always failed to say quickly enough. Maybe he thought he had silenced me, but maybe he had handed me the one medium where I could speak fully, honestly, uninterrupted. My hands trembled as I typed the first few lines, not the message he expected, not the casual update he assumed, but the truth I had tried to say that morning, the truth he had brushed aside, the truth that once spoken would change everything he thought he knew about me, about us, about the years he never understood. I took a breath, and I continued typing. Because if he wanted my words, he would have to read all of them. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of being heard. I stared at the glowing screen for so long, the letters began to blur into one another, merging into a quiet haze that pulsed gently with the rhythm of my breathing. The cursor blinked in its steady, patient way, waiting for me to continue, waiting for me to gather the courage to articulate what had lived unspoken inside me for years. I had typed only a few sentences, barely the beginning, but already the air in the room felt heavier, thick with the weight of everything I had held back. For decades, I had chosen silence when words trembled in my throat, chosen gentleness when truth felt too sharp, chosen to pace my speech to match the comfort of others. But with each character I pressed onto the screen, I realized I was not pacing anything now. I was not adjusting, not softening myself, not making sure my pauses didn't inconvenience someone. I was writing the way I felt, and it was a revelation so quiet it frightened me. I paused, my hands hovering above the phone, and for a moment I closed my eyes and listened to the sound of my house breathing around me. The familiar tick of the wall clock, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the wind brushing softly against the outside windows. The world inside my home had become an echo of who I had turned into over the years. Soft, slow, consistent, a place where time stretched gently instead of sprinting. A place where words could take their time and no one side in impatience. I had built this sanctuary alone. I had lived within its stillness so long that I had forgotten what it felt like to be rushed, to feel like my voice was a burden. And yet part of me felt guilty even now. Guilty for taking up space, guilty for being slow, guilty for not fitting into the rhythm of a world that demanded speed. I thought about my son, always moving, always talking fast, always treating time like a currency he could not afford to waste. Somewhere along the way, I had let his pace become the standard, as if my slower rhythm was a flaw. As if I was the one who needed to adapt, as if his sighs were signals I had to obey. But sitting there with the phone in my hand, I felt a shift within myself, a subtle realignment of something that had been bent for too long. He had told me to text because I talked too slow. He believed he had dismissed my voice, but he had unknowingly invited me into a space where his speed held no authority. A text had no interruptions, no sighs, no rushed tone, no clock ticking loudly in his silence. A text was a quiet room where I could speak fully, and if he didn't want to hear my voice, he would instead read the truth he had ignored. I began typing again, letting the words flow from a place I usually kept hidden. I wrote about the morning, about how long it took for me to gather courage to call, about how important the conversation had been for me, about the way his dismissal cut deeper than he could possibly understand. I wrote slowly, but the ideas came quickly now, as if they had been waiting years to escape. Every sentence felt weighted, not with anger, but with a quiet ache I had carried alone. Then I reached the part I had avoided even in my own thoughts. The reason I had called him in the first place, the truth I had meant to share. My fingers trembled as I typed it, not because it was shameful, not because it was dramatic, but because it was mine. And I had not shared anything of mine with him in a long time. Mothers are taught to give, not reveal, to support, not confess, to listen, not speak. But I typed the words anyway, letting the truth settle into the empty space of the message thread. I told him I hadn't been feeling well for months, that my memory sometimes blurred at the edges, that certain words slipped away when I tried to reach for them, that my hands shook when I held things too long, that the doctor had ordered tests, that I had been too afraid to tell him before, and that when I finally worked up the courage to share all of this, he had cut me off because my pauses were too long for his comfort. I typed the truth with a clarity I had not been able to speak aloud, and when I finished, my thumb hovered over the send button. A strange mixture of pride and fear swirled within me. Was I ready for him to know? Was I ready for the silence that might follow? Was I ready for the reality that my son, the center of my life for so many years, might not understand how much strength it took for me to share something vulnerable? I took a deep breath, closed my eyes briefly, and pressed send. The message left my screen like a stone thrown into still water, creating ripples I could not control. I placed the phone on the table face down and walked away, unwilling to sit there and wait for a response that might never come. Instead, I moved into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, though my hands shook enough to spill a few drops onto the counter. I sat at the little round table near the window, watching the afternoon sunlight spill across the floor in slow, warm streaks. Minutes passed. Then more, the phone remained silent. No vibration, no reply, no call, just quiet. A deep, consuming quiet that wrapped itself around me like a question with no answer. I tried not to look at the phone, but my gaze kept drifting back to it. I told myself he was busy. I told myself he hadn't seen the message yet. I told myself he needed time to process. But beneath all those rationalizations, I felt the old fear return, the fear that maybe he simply didn't want to engage. That maybe vulnerability from me was an inconvenience too. That maybe the pause between reading my pain and offering his comfort would stretch longer than I had the strength to endure. I picked up the phone again and checked. No response. I set it down and closed my eyes, pressing my fingertips briefly against my temple to stop the pounding rhythm of anxiety creeping through my skull. Time passed differently in these moments, stretching and folding in ways that made seconds feel like hours. I stood up, unable to sit still, and wandered into the living room where the pictures of him still lined the shelves. His school photos, his graduation, his first apartment. His smile in every one of them bright and confident, the smile of someone who believed the world would always move at his pace. I traced a fingertip along the frame of one photo, remembering a time when he used to slow down just for me. When he used to listen with wide, curious eyes, when my words felt welcome, when my pauses didn't bother him, when he would lean his head on my shoulder, unafraid of the quiet between us. I stood there, holding that memory like something precious and fragile. Then my phone buzzed. I turned quickly, heart leaping into my throat, but when I checked the screen, it wasn't my son. It was an automated reminder about a prescription pickup. The disappointment settled inside me like heavy ash, soft but suffocating. I set the phone down and felt a wave of exhaustion wash over me, the kind that did not come from the body but from the soul. It was getting late when the message finally arrived. I saw his name on the screen and my heart beat too fast, anticipation and dread twisting together in a single painful rhythm. I opened the message. It was short, much shorter than mine. He said he was sorry to hear I hadn't been feeling well. He said he hadn't realized it was serious. He said he wished I had told him sooner. And then, almost as an afterthought, he added that he would call me sometime soon when he had a moment. A moment. I felt something tighten painfully in my chest. I reread the message, hoping I had misunderstood the tone, but there was nothing more hidden between the lines. His response was polite, distant, functional, like he was acknowledging a weather report instead of his own mother's fear. I sat back in the chair and closed my eyes, letting the disappointment settle deeper. It wasn't anger. It wasn't hurt. It was a kind of resignation that came from realizing you had spoken your truth only to be met with gentle indifference. But beneath that disappointment, another feeling began to grow, something I had not felt in years. a quiet fire, a stirring of strength, a sense that maybe I had more to say, more than he could dismiss with a brief message. Maybe it was time to tell him everything. Not just the health scare, not just the reason I called, but everything he didn't know about me, everything he never asked, everything I had buried so deeply beneath years of being a mother that I had nearly forgotten I existed outside of that role. If he wanted text messages, he would receive them. But they would not be the kind he expected. Because if my spoken voice was too slow for him, then my written words would finally show him the woman he had never taken the time to see. And my final message, whether he was ready for it or not, would change everything he believed about the mother he thought he knew. The night after receiving his distant message unfolded in a way that felt strangely hollow, as if the house itself sensed the shift inside me and chose to remain silent. I moved through each room slowly, touching the backs of chairs, smoothing the edges of blankets, wiping dust from the corners of shelves with mechanical motions that carried no urgency. It was as though my body needed movement to mask the ache twisting inside my chest. His message, short as it was, echoed through me with a kind of quiet sting that lingered long after the screen went dark. A moment for his mother. A moment squeezed somewhere between meetings and errands, and the rush of a life that had begun to shrink the space he once gave me. I tried to tell myself not to be hurt, that he had never meant it cruelly, but no matter how many times I repeated it, the truth kept rising like a tide I could not hold back. The boy who once begged me to stay in his room until he fell asleep now gave me moments. Not minutes, not hours, moments. I sat at the edge of my bed, the lamplight casting a pale circle across the floor, and allowed myself to acknowledge something I had avoided for years. My son and I no longer lived in the same emotional world. He lived in a place defined by speed and efficiency, where every conversation had a purpose and every pause was a waste of time. I lived in a place shaped by patience and reflection, where conversations unfolded like pages in a book, and every pause meant something. Somewhere along the way, his pace had outrun mine, leaving me stranded in the quiet spaces he no longer visited. Perhaps this was what aging felt like, not the aches or the slower steps or the forgetfulness, but the gradual realization that the world had begun moving too quickly for you, and the people you loved most were being carried away by the tide. I lay down for a while, staring at the ceiling, watching the shadows shift as the wind brushed against the window pane. I replayed the call in my mind again and again, hearing the way he interrupted me, the way he laughed lightly, as if my struggle to articulate my thoughts was a harmless nuisance. I had always known I took longer to speak now. The words didn't flow as effortlessly as they once had. Sometimes they drifted away before I could catch them, leaving me searching for them like misplaced keys. But I had never imagined my son would find it frustrating enough to silence me. I had never believed he would choose convenience over connection. And yet, there it was, his voice telling me to text, his impatience disguised as practicality, his dismissal delivered with the careless tone of someone who no longer understood the value of listening. I woke the next morning with a heaviness in my limbs, the kind that made it difficult to push the blankets aside. The house felt colder, though the thermostat read the same. I brewed tea and sat by the window, watching the early sunlight creep across the lawn in slow golden lines. The steam rising from the mug curled upward like a fragile whisper, and I wondered how many times in the past I had brushed off my own hurt to protect his comfort. How many times I had softened my voice because he grew restless. How many sentences I had abandoned halfway because he lost interest. How many truths I had hidden because they seemed too heavy for him. I had mistaken silence for love. I had mistaken self-erasure for sacrifice. I had mistaken quiet endurance for strength, but strength was something else entirely. Strength was what I felt growing inside me now, steady and undeniable. It wasn't anger that filled me. It wasn't resentment. It was a deep, resonant clarity that felt like opening a door that had been stuck for years. My son knew the surface of me. The mother who cooked his meals, folded his clothes, clapped at his graduations, mailed him care packages, visited him on weekends with baked goods and stories. But he did not know my fears. He did not know the losses that shaped me. He did not know the dreams I let go of so he could chase his. He did not know the loneliness that crept in after he moved out, when the house became too quiet and I became a background presence in his busy life. He did not know the memories that lingered like ghosts in every corner of my home. He did not know the truths I had hidden beneath gentle smiles. If he wanted text messages, then perhaps it was time he finally learned all of it. The idea came slowly at first, a fragile spark flickering in the back of my mind. But the more I thought about it, the stronger it grew, until it pulsed like a heartbeat. My final message, not out of revenge, not out of desperation, but out of a need to reclaim my voice, to tell my story, to reveal the parts of me he had never bothered to see. My voice had always trembled when I spoke, but my written words did not tremble. They did not falter. They did not slow. They held a strength that my aging tongue could not carry anymore. And for the first time, I realized he had opened a door without meaning to, a door into the truth. I picked up my phone and opened a new message thread. The blank screen stared back at me, wide and silent, as if inviting me to pour into it everything I had swallowed for years. I typed slowly at first, letting the words find their way. I told him I wanted to share more about what I hadn't been able to say on the phone. I told him I needed him to listen in this quiet way, without rushing me, without cutting me off. I told him these messages would be long, not because I wanted to take his time, but because I finally needed to speak honestly. After typing those few opening lines, I hesitated again, the weight of the next steps pressing against me like a tide at my feet. There were things I had carried alone for decades, things I never told him because he had always been too young, too fragile, too busy, too distant. But maybe now was the time. Maybe now he was finally old enough to understand who I was before I became his mother. Maybe now he needed to know the parts of me that were never visible to him. I began with the simplest truth. I told him that when he was little, he used to sit on my lap and listen to every story I told, even when my voice was slow, even when I searched for words. I told him he used to find comfort in the pauses, leaning his head against my chest, as if the silence between sentences was a place to rest. I told him that somewhere along the line, the silence became uncomfortable for him, and I had let it become uncomfortable for me too. I told him that losing that softness had hurt in ways I had never admitted. And then the memories surfaced. Memories I had not visited in years. Memories of my own mother, who spoke slowly too, whose thoughts wandered like drifting petals, who I had once dismissed with the same impatience my son now showed me. I typed about her, about how young and rushed I had been, about how I never understood how deeply it wounded her when I hurried her along. I typed about the day I found her old letters after she had passed, letters she had written but never sent, letters filled with truths she feared I would not care to hear. I told him I kept those letters. I told him I read them every year on her birthday. I told him they were the reason I had tried so hard to be patient with him, even when he wasn't patient with me. My hands trembled as memories bloomed untouched inside me, memories I had hidden even from myself. And yet they felt right to share now, not to guilt him, not to manipulate him, but to show him who I was beyond the soft mother he took for granted. Just as I finished writing a section about the test results I was still waiting for, my phone buzzed. A message from him. A short one again. He asked politely if everything I was sending was really necessary. He said he was at work and couldn't read long texts during the day. He asked if I could keep things brief. The request struck something in me that I couldn't ignore anymore. He wasn't trying to hurt me. He simply didn't understand the depth of what it meant for me to speak, to finally tell the truth after a lifetime of silence. I felt my heart tighten, but instead of shrinking, something inside me expanded. I realized then that the final message I would one day send him would not be short. It would not be simplified. It would not be trimmed to fit the boundaries of his attention span. It would be the full truth, every part of it. Because the woman I had been before motherhood deserved to be known. The woman I had become during motherhood deserved to be understood. And the woman I was now, with fears pressing against the inside of her chest and memories whispering at the edges of her mind, deserved to be heard. I typed again, slower this time, but with a certainty that steadied me. One day, I wrote, I will send you something that will tell you everything. And when you read it, you'll finally understand why I needed you to listen. I did not send that message yet, but I saved it, because my final message was forming inside me. And soon, it would change everything he thought he knew. The days that followed felt strangely suspended, as if time itself had paused just enough for me to listen to the quiet truths drifting through the corners of my own mind. I moved through the house with a slowness that felt intentional, rather than accidental, touching the edges of furniture, straightening frames, on the wall, pressing my palm, briefly against the side of the refrigerator, as I passed. Grounding myself in the present moment, because my thoughts were beginning to wander more than I wanted to admit. The test results lingered in the back of my mind like a distant storm cloud waiting to break open. Yet it was not only the uncertainty of my health that unsettled me. It was the awareness that my son did not understand the urgency inside me. The urgency that came not from fear of illness, but from the realization that life had become something fragile and fleeting, and easily overlooked by a mind too busy to notice. His messages over the next few days were brief, clipped, polite in the way people are polite when trying to rush past a conversation. He asked how I was feeling, but never long enough to hear a full answer. He told me he had seen my texts, but was too busy to read them properly. He asked me to summarize things when I could. And each message, though not unkind, layered itself inside me like thin sheets of ice forming over a lake, making the surface colder, harder, more brittle. I responded gently each time, not because I wanted to soften the truth, but because I needed to watch him carefully, to understand how far he had drifted, to see how much of the boy he once was still lived beneath the man rushing through his days. One evening, after receiving another short message from him asking if I could keep things simple because he was juggling too much, I set the phone down and walked into the living room. The golden light of sunset spilled across the rug, stretching long shadows toward the hallway like silent invitations to remember. I sat in my old armchair and let the memories rise. Memories I had buried in the quiet vaults of the mind where mothers keep their unspoken stories. Stories of the woman I had been before him, stories of the sacrifices I had made after him, stories that had shaped the quiet ache now blooming inside my ribs. I remembered nights when I stayed awake listening for his footsteps, worrying when he was out with friends, worrying when he was late coming home, worrying when the world tilted slightly out of my control. I remembered the mornings I made his breakfast even when I was exhausted. The afternoons I helped him with homework, even when my head ached the evenings. I sat patiently at the edge of his bed, listening to him talk about dreams, disappointments, crushes, fears, his small voice pressed against the dark like a beacon. I remembered the warmth in his eyes when he used to look at me with trust, the way he pulled at the sleeve of my shirt when he wanted my attention, the way he clung to my hand the first time I took him to school. Those memories rose like soft waves, washing gently through me, reminding me of the connection we once had, reminding me of the distance now stretching between us. But there were other memories too, the ones that stung, the ones that carried shadows. The times he rolled his eyes when I repeated myself, the times he looked at his phone as I spoke, the times he called me dramatic when I tried to share something vulnerable. The times he rushed me through my sentences, not realizing how much energy it took for me to find them. The years slowly unfolding into a pattern I had ignored because I believed love meant endurance. But endurance had turned into silence, and silence had turned into invisibility. I sat in that chair for a long time, letting the memories drift through me like pages from a book I had forgotten I had written. Then I stood up slowly, deliberately, and went to my desk drawer where I kept a small collection of notebooks. Some were filled. Some were empty. All of them held pieces of me that no one else had ever seen. I pulled out a new one, its cover a soft, worn blue, and placed it on the table. My fingers traced its edges lightly before opening it. For a moment, I simply stared at the blank page, its emptiness both daunting and inviting. Then I began writing. Not a message yet, not the final text he would one day read, but a beginning, a map of the truth. A quiet unraveling of the stories I had buried deep inside me. The handwriting came slowly, shaky at first, then steadier as memories poured out. I wrote about my childhood. I wrote about my mother and her slow voice. I wrote about her letters. I wrote about the loneliness she felt that I never understood until now. I wrote about the fear inside me, not the fear of illness, but the fear of disappearing from the life of the person I loved most. I wrote about the ache that came with every hurried message, every interruption, every distancing sigh. I wrote because the words needed to exist somewhere outside my mind before they vanished from memory like smoke dissolving in cold air. Writing steadied me. Writing reminded me there were parts of me that still lived quietly beneath the years of caretaking and softness. Writing reminded me that my story mattered even when spoken slowly, even when typed painfully, even when read by no one. And as the pages filled, I felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and relief settle into my bones, grounding me in a way conversations no longer could. The next day, while folding laundry, I found myself thinking about the tests again, about the doctor's quiet voice telling me they needed further imaging, about the way my hands had trembled when I called my son in the first place, hoping he might slow down long enough to hear the fear beneath my words. And the memory of his impatience tightened inside me, not with anger, but with a sorrow so heavy it pressed against my chest like stone. I checked my phone that afternoon and found another brief message from him. He said he hoped everything was okay. He said he would try to call later if he wasn't too tired. He said he loved me. But even that final line felt like an afterthought, a polite signature rather than a lived feeling. I held the phone tightly for a moment, feeling a quiet desperation bloom inside me. Not the desperation of a mother wanting to cling to her child, but the desperation of a woman noticing that her voice had slipped so far from his world that he no longer recognized it. I set the phone aside and returned to the notebook. My handwriting grew stronger. It felt like reclaiming something I had lost: my voice, my pace, my truth. All of it poured onto the page without hesitation. And as I wrote, an idea began forming in the back of my mind, a steady, persistent thought that grew stronger with each passing hour. Maybe my son did not know me because I had never given him the full truth. Maybe I had only ever shown him the part of me that made motherhood easier for him. Maybe it was time to show him everything, not through rushed conversations that made me stumble, not through brief calls filled with interruptions, but through a message he would have no choice but to read all the way through. A final message, one that would reveal the woman behind the pauses, the woman behind the gentle voice, the woman behind the slow sentences he no longer had patience for, a message he could not interrupt, a message he could not rush, a message he could not silence. Later that evening, I typed another text to him. It was simple. I told him I would update him soon. I told him I appreciated him checking in. I told him I hoped he was taking care of himself. He responded with a short message and a heart emoji. And for the first time, the emoji felt like a wall instead of love. I sat in the quiet living room afterward with the notebook open on my lap, and I realized something unmistakable. I was preparing to tell him the truth not because he asked for it, but because he needed it. Because our relationship had drifted into a place where he no longer saw the woman who raised him, only the role she filled. Because the distance between us had grown long enough that my words, once spoken slowly, now needed to be carved into something he could not ignore. I closed the notebook gently, held it against my chest, and understood fully, deeply, irrevocably that the message I would send would not be a plea for attention. It would be the truth. And once he read it, nothing would remain the same. The days that followed settled over me like a quiet fog, soft but heavy, cloaking every corner of the house with a kind of muted weight that felt both comforting and suffocating. I moved through each hour as if walking through a dream where nothing was urgent, yet everything carried a strange pressure just beneath the surface. The notebook stayed on the coffee table, its blue cover closed but pulsing with unspoken truths inside it, like a small heartbeat waiting for the right moment to be revealed. I found myself glancing at it more often than I glanced at my phone, and that alone told me how far things had shifted. For years, I had lived in anticipation of my son's messages, needing the reassurance of his attention, like a subtle reassurance that I still belonged somewhere in the rushing world he lived in. But now every vibration of the phone felt like a reminder of the distance between us, the polite messages, the short responses, the impatience dressed up as modern convenience. It was the notebook, not the phone, that now held the pieces of me he had never bothered to see. One afternoon, as I sat at the dining table peeling an orange in the slow, deliberate way my hands required these days, I heard the faint buzz of a new message arriving. I ignored it at first, letting the sound fade into the background, letting the soft citrus scent fill the space around me. But then a part of me, the part conditioned by years of being a mother who responded immediately to every need, told me to check. When I finally picked up the phone, I saw a message from him asking if I could come over for dinner that weekend. The invitation should have warmed me, but instead it unsettled something quiet inside my chest. It was his attempt, I knew, to prove he cared, to check in just enough to ease his conscience, but not enough to slow his pace. Still, I accepted. Part of me needed to see him. Part of me needed to know whether the distance between us was growing or merely changing shape. The day of the visit arrived with an unexpected chill in the air, a breeze that swept along the street, carrying dry leaves across the pavement. I dressed carefully, choosing a soft sweater and comfortable shoes, fixing my hair with more attention than usual. Not because I wanted to impress him, but because I wanted to feel steady, anchored, present. The drive to his home felt longer than it used to, every turn revealing memories of rides we had taken together when he was younger. Memories of him chattering in the backseat, memories of conversations that once filled the car with warmth instead of silence. When I arrived, he greeted me with a quick hug and a smile that seemed sincere but exhausted. His home felt cold in the way homes do when no one stays long enough to warm them. The furniture was neat, the surfaces spotless, but the air felt rushed, as if even the walls held their breath. He offered me tea, and I watched him move around the kitchen with practiced efficiency, reaching for mugs, boiling water, stirring sugar. He talked about work, about projects, about deadlines. His words came quickly, overlapping each other, barely touching the edges of actual meaning. He filled the space with noise, perhaps to avoid the silence, perhaps to avoid the possibility of slowing down long enough for feelings to rise. I listened, nodding, smiling gently, even though none of it settled inside me. There was no space for me in the conversation. Not really. It was as if he was performing the role of a good son without realizing that the performance left no room for connection. When he finally paused long enough to look at me, he asked how I'd been feeling. The question should have opened a door, but instead it felt like a polite knock on one he didn't intend to enter. I told him I was waiting for the doctor to call. He nodded absently and said to keep him updated. Then he shifted back to his work schedule, the rhythm of his words picking up speed again, leaving mine behind like scattered pebbles on the side of a road. Dinner was quick, eaten with one eye on the clock, and afterward he hugged me again, this time less distracted but still hurried. He said he would call soon. He said we should spend more time together. He said he loved me. And I believed him, but I also felt the hollowness beneath it. The way love spoken too quickly can feel like an echo rather than a truth. On the drive home, I felt my chest tighten, not with pain but with a strange clarity. He loved me in the way people love constants, in the way people love things that do not demand anything in return. He loved me safely. But he did not see me. When I returned home, the silence greeted me like an old friend. I slipped off my shoes, placed my sweater over the chair, and walked to the living room. The notebook waited there, untouched but patient. I sat down and opened it again, turning to a fresh page. Something inside me had shifted after that visit. Something that made me realize the message I was shaping was not simply a reflection of what I felt. It was a necessary truth he needed to receive, not because he had earned it, but because he had never given himself the time to understand who his mother actually was. He knew my recipes, my routines, my soft reassurances, but he did not know my heart. He did not know the things I had endured. He did not know the fears that wrapped themselves around me during the quiet nights. He did not know the loneliness that lingered even when he said, "I love you," in passing. I began writing again. I wrote about the years after his father left, about the nights I held myself together so he wouldn't see me break, about the bills I paid with shaking hands, about the exhaustion that settled deep in my bones while I pretended to be unshakable. I wrote about the sacrifices I made quietly because I never wanted him to feel lacking. I wrote about the jobs I took simply to keep the lights on. I wrote about how I whispered affirmations to myself in the bathroom mirror so I could keep smiling for him. These were the stories he had never heard, the stories he had never had the patience to ask about. And as I wrote them, the truth sharpened inside me. He knew the mother I was to him. He did not know the woman behind her. My phone buzzed again. Another short message from him. He thanked me for dinner. He said he was tired. He said he would talk soon. I stared at the message for a long moment, feeling a quiet ache rise in me again, the kind of ache that comes from being halfway seen. The kind of ache that whispers that love without awareness is a hollow thing. The kind of ache that told me he still didn't understand how close he was to losing the chance to really know me. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I felt something crystallize inside me with a clarity so profound it startled me. The message I would send him was no longer just about my health or my memories or my slow voice. It was about truth. It was about identity. It was about letting him see me fully for the first time. I realized then that the message forming in my notebook would not be something I sent lightly. It would be the kind of message that arrived at the right moment, the kind that would force him to stop, to breathe, to feel, the kind that would puncture the speed of his world and make him understand the weight of what he had been dismissing. I closed my eyes that night and whispered quietly into the darkness, not as a prayer but as a promise. He will know me, even if it takes my final message to make him see. The morning the doctor called arrived without warning, slipping into my life in the soft gray hour just before dawn when the world feels fragile and half awake. I had been lying in bed, listening to the restless murmur of my own thoughts weaving through the silence of the house, when the phone rang. The sound startled me so sharply that my breath caught in my chest, and for a moment I wasn't sure if I was dreaming. I reached for the phone with trembling fingers and saw the clinic's number glowing faintly against the dim light. My heart tightened, not with panic but with a cold, quiet understanding. The call I had been waiting for had arrived. I answered with a voice barely above a whisper, and as the doctor spoke, each word seemed to stretch through the room slowly, evenly, without urgency. He used a tone that doctors reserve for conversations that matter, for news that needs to be absorbed gently. He told me the results weren't definitive yet. He told me the scans showed changes that required more evaluation. He told me they needed additional tests to understand what was causing the memory lapses, the foggy moments, the difficulty finding words. He told me they couldn't say it was serious, but they couldn't say it was. His words moved softly, but carried a weight that settled deep inside my bones, a weight I had sensed but never voiced. When the call ended, I held the phone to my chest and sat in the stillness of my bedroom, letting the truth sink in without letting it swallow me whole. When I finally stood, the world outside my window was shifting from gray to pale gold, the sky slowly washing itself with the first hints of light. I walked into the kitchen, made tea with hands that trembled only slightly, and sat by the window, watching the steam rise into the soft morning air. The doctor's words echoed inside me, but what struck me most wasn't fear. It was the realization that time, already fragile, might be even more delicate than I had believed. My memory, my voice, my thoughts, the pieces of me that had always moved slowly, might slow further still. And my son, who had already begun drifting from me, might never understand the urgency in the space that stretched between us. I found myself reaching for the notebook without thinking, my fingers brushing over the soft, worn cover before opening it to the page I had left unfinished. The words I had written the night before now felt heavier, sharper, more necessary. I added to them slowly, carefully, trying to capture truths that felt like they might slip away if I didn't place them on paper. I wrote about the call. I wrote about the fear I felt not of illness, but of disappearing from my son's understanding before he ever truly knew me. I wrote about the weight of silence that had grown between us. I wrote about how fragile life felt now, how every conversation carried the echo of what might never be said if the world shifted suddenly. As I wrote, my phone buzzed with a message from him. It was short, as always. He asked how the test went. He apologized for not calling the night before. He said he had been too tired. And then he added the line that struck me with a cold ache. Can you give me a quick update? Just the essentials, just the essentials. I felt something inside me settle and crack at the same time. The essentials. As if the complexities of my fear, the nuance of my health, the slowness of my voice, and the truth of my heart could be reduced to clean lines in a text box. As if I were a brief report rather than a human being carrying memories and aching truths. I sat there staring at the message, letting the silence of the house grow heavy around me. For the first time, I understood fully that my son did not mean to be dismissive. He simply did not know how to exist in the softness I required. He did not know how to pause long enough to let a story unfold. He did not know how to make space for another person's truth when his life was crowded with noise and urgency. I typed a brief update because I couldn't bear the thought of overwhelming him again, but it was not the update he needed. It was the one he asked for: functional, clean, emotionless. I told him the doctor needed more tests. I told him they weren't sure yet. I told him I would let him know when I learned more. He responded with a single line and a heart emoji. The heart felt hollow, like something inserted quickly before he put his phone away. something meant to signal affection without requiring presence. Something that once would have comforted me but now settled over my chest like a thin layer of frost. After that brief exchange, the day stretched ahead of me like a landscape without direction. I folded laundry slowly, letting the rhythm of smoothing fabric soothe my restless thoughts. I watered the plants on the windowsill, watching the sunlight hit their leaves in soft, shimmering lines. I took a brief walk outside, letting the cool air clear the heaviness pressing against my ribs. But every small task felt touched by the truth of the morning call, the truth my son didn't yet understand, the truth I wasn't sure how to tell him without being dismissed again. Later that afternoon, as I sat in the living room, I found myself speaking quietly into the empty air. I told the room the words I wished I could say aloud to him without being cut off. I told the room that I was afraid, that I was tired, that I felt myself slipping sometimes, losing threads of thoughts I once held tightly. And as I spoke to no one, I realized how great the quiet inside me had grown, not the peaceful kind, the kind that gathers when someone's voice has been silenced for too long. I looked at the notebook again, its blue cover soft beneath the dimming light. Something in me knew that my message, the one I would eventually send, needed to be more than a confession. It needed to be a story that would force him to stop. A story that would not ask for his attention, but demand it. A story that would show him everything he had never slowed down long enough to see. A story that would make him feel the weight of my pauses instead of rushing past them. As the sun dipped low into the horizon, casting long shadows across the floor, the phone rang again. I checked the screen expecting another automated reminder or a distant voice. But it was him this time, my son. The moment startled me because unexpected calls from him were rare now, as rare as the unhurried conversations we once shared. I answered quickly, and for a moment neither of us spoke, as if we were both searching for the rhythm we once knew. He asked if I had plans for the evening. His voice was casual but threaded with something uncertain, as if he was feeling around for a connection without knowing where to find it. I told him I didn't. He said he wanted to stop by. He said it lightly, as if it were not remarkable, but something inside me shifted. Something in his tone felt softer than usual, less hurried, and so I told him to come. When he arrived, the house felt different, as if the walls held their breath. He walked in and paused, looking around as if he could sense the quiet pressing against the space. He smiled awkwardly and said he thought we could talk. The word talk felt fragile on his tongue, like something he had forgotten how to do slowly. We sat in the living room, the light from the lamp casting a warm glow between us. He asked again about the test. I repeated what the doctor said. He listened this time, really listened, his eyes focused on me in a way that felt unfamiliar. But then, when I began to speak further, when I reached for deeper truths, his impatience flickered again. His eyes drifted to his phone for a moment. His leg bounced slightly. He nodded too quickly. It was subtle, but sharp enough to cut through the fragile attempt at connection. I felt myself retreat mid-sentence, the words scraping against my throat as I swallowed them back. He didn't notice. He hugged me when he left, tighter than usual, but I felt the hollowness beneath it again, the distance disguised by affection. And when he walked out the door, something inside me finally crystallized. I loved him. But he did not know me. Not the way I needed him to. Not the way I needed him to remember me if the doctor's concerns proved true. Not the way a child should know the woman who raised them, who gave them everything, who stood silently in the background of their rushed life. The truth hit me with a weight that left me breathless. If I disappeared slowly, if my voice faded, if my memories blurred, if parts of me slipped away, he would not even know what he had lost. Unless I told him first. Unless I gave him the truth in a way he could not ignore. Unless I sent him the message that had been building inside me for weeks. The message that would change everything he believed about the mother who spoke too slowly for his world. The message only I could write, and I would write it soon. Because time, suddenly, felt like something I could no longer let slip quietly between my fingers. The night I finally wrote the message felt unlike any night I had lived through in years. The air inside the house was unnaturally still, so quiet that even my own breathing felt intrusive, as if something sacred were beginning to take shape in the silence. I turned off every light except the lamp beside my chair, letting the soft gold glow fall across the notebook and the phone resting beside it. I sat down slowly, almost ceremonially, and rested my hands in my lap for a long moment before touching anything. I could feel the truth rising inside me, not chaotic or desperate, but steady, powerful, inevitable, like a tide that had waited too long to break. I picked up the notebook first. The pages I had already filled seemed to vibrate with the weight of the stories I had poured into them. Stories of who I was before motherhood. Stories of who I became because of motherhood. Stories of the years I held myself together so he could build his dreams without ever seeing the cracks in mine. Stories of the things I had been too slow, too gentle, too frightened, or too patient to say aloud. I read a few paragraphs, my own handwriting blurring as my eyes filled with a quiet ache. Then I closed the notebook gently and placed it beside me, because the time for writing in secret was over. I opened the message thread with my son and stared at the empty input bar for a long time, letting the quiet settle around me. The cursor blinked patiently, the same way it had on the morning this all began, but this time my hesitation did not come from fear. It came from reverence, because I knew, without a doubt, that once I pressed send, nothing between us would ever return to what it had been. And strangely, that realization did not hurt. It felt necessary. It felt right. It felt like opening a door we both needed in order to find each other again. I began typing. My words came slowly but steadily, each sentence forming with a clarity that surprised me. I told him that I needed him to read everything with patience. I told him not to skim, not to rush, not to treat this message like the others. I told him I needed him to give me something he had forgotten how to offer. His time, his presence. His heart opened just enough to hear me, even if my voice was written instead of spoken. Then I told him the truth. I told him that the doctor was concerned about the changes in my memory. I told him that some days words slipped away from me before I could catch them. I told him that the fog drifting through my mind frightened me in ways I had not allowed myself to admit aloud. I told him that I did not know what the future would hold, but I knew that whatever time I had, it mattered deeply that he understood me before anything changed. I told him that his impatience, though small to him, had carved deep wounds inside me because it made me feel like I was fading long before any diagnosis confirmed it. But I didn't stop there. I told him about my mother, about how I had once dismissed her slow voice the same way he dismissed mine, about the letters I found after she died, letters filled with truths she had been too patient, too quiet, too overlooked to share during her life. I told him how much I regretted never listening, never slowing down, never seeing her before she became a memory. I told him her silence had haunted me, and I never wanted my silence to haunt him in the same way. Then I told him the parts he had never known. I told him about the nights after his father left when I stood in the kitchen with shaking hands, trying to pay bills I didn't know how to afford. I told him about the mornings I woke with fear wrapped around my ribs, but smiled at him anyway so he would not carry my burdens. I told him about the years I worked 2 jobs and swallowed exhaustion until it became another organ inside me. I told him about my loneliness after he moved out, the hollow evenings, the empty hours, the nights I cooked enough for 2 out of habit and sat alone at the table trying to convince myself it didn't matter. I told him I had loved him through all of it, not with grand gestures, but with 1,000 quiet sacrifices he never knew existed. I told him I didn't resent him for not knowing. I only wished he had been curious enough to ask. The message grew longer and longer, enough to fill countless screens, but I did not stop. My truth had waited too long for space, and now it flowed freely. I told him I was afraid he would one day speak of me in past tense without ever knowing who I had been. I told him I wanted him to remember me not as the mother who spoke slowly, or forgot words, or repeated herself, or paused too long, but as the woman who survived more than she ever admitted, who loved more quietly than he ever realized, who held him together while she was falling apart. Then I wrote the final lines, the ones that felt as though they had been building inside me for years. I told him that I treasured him with every part of my being, but I could no longer accept being the background noise in his fast-moving life. I told him that love requires presence, not convenience. I told him that if he wanted to know me, truly know me, he needed to slow down. He needed to pause. He needed to listen. I ended with a single request. I asked him to come over tomorrow evening. No rush, no schedule, no divided attention, just time. Real time, the kind we hadn't shared since he was young. And then, with a deep breath that shook through my entire body, I pressed send. The message left my phone like a release of years of silence, disappearing into the digital space with a finality that made my heart pound. I put the phone face down on the table and waited, not with desperation, not with fear, but with a quiet, profound certainty that whatever happened next would reveal exactly who my son truly was beneath the speed of his life. For a long time, nothing happened. The house was silent. The air felt thick. My heart beat slowly, steadily, not racing, not trembling. I felt strangely calm. It was the calm of truth finally expressed. The calm of no longer carrying a burden alone. The calm of knowing I had said everything I needed to say, not for him, but for myself. Then my phone buzzed just once. I stared at it for a long moment before picking it up, my breath suspended in my chest like a fragile thread. I opened the message, expecting hesitation, confusion, or worse, dismissal. But what I found was none of those things. Mom, I am coming tonight. The words hit me with an impact I wasn't prepared for. They were simple, they were short, but they carried a weight his other messages never had. There was no emoji, no rushed tone, no clipped phrasing, just intention. Pure, quiet intention. He arrived an hour later. When he stepped into the house, he wasn't moving quickly for once. He stood in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes wide and filled with something I hadn't seen in years. Not fear, not guilt, not confusion. Awareness. A painful, aching awareness that something inside him had shifted. He looked at me the way a child looks at the sun after realizing it can burn. He walked toward me slowly, hesitantly, as if approaching a truth he wasn't sure he deserved to hold. And then he did something that unraveled me completely. He knelt beside my chair. Not sat, not hovered, knelt. He took my hands gently in his, and when he looked up at me, tears had gathered in his eyes, trembling but unfallen. His voice shook when he spoke. He told me he had read every word. He told me he had never slowed down long enough to see me. He told me he did not know how he had drifted so far. He told me he never wanted me to feel invisible again. Then he leaned his forehead against my hands, and the sound that escaped him was the kind of soft, broken exhale that belongs only to someone finally realizing the truth of what they've almost lost. I rested my hand lightly on his head and felt something inside me uncoil, something that had been wound too tightly for too long. He didn't try to apologize quickly. He didn't rush to fix anything. He stayed there on the floor beside me, holding my hands as if he were anchoring himself to something he had almost let slip away. We talked after that, slowly, patiently. He did not interrupt me once. He did not check his phone. He did not rush my pauses. He listened with his whole being, as if every breath I took mattered, as if he had finally learned the rhythm of my voice again. And as I spoke, something inside him softened, broke, rebuilt, and returned in a new shape entirely. When he finally left that night, he hugged me with both arms, his face pressed into my shoulder, and whispered that he would come back tomorrow. Not for a moment, for time, real time, and I believed him, because my final message had not broken him, it had opened him. And in that opening, I finally saw the boy I once raised returning to the man he was meant to be. If this story touched you, follow the channel for more powerful, raw, heart-shaking stories every week. I write about family, sacrifice, betrayal, healing, motherhood, and the moments that change everything. Follow now so you never miss the next story that breaks your heart and puts it back together. Like, share, and comment to support the channel and help these emotional stories reach more people. Turn on notifications so you're always first to read what comes next. Your support keeps these stories alive. Stay with the channel, more unforgettable stories are on the way.